Bubba Wallace came into Martinsville Speedway on March 29, 2026, sitting third in the NASCAR Cup Series championship standings. He had 4 top 11 finishes in his first 5 races. His season looked like the beginning of something real, something that could end with a legitimate title run. By the time the checkered flag fell that afternoon, 12 cars were in the wall. Wallace had been credited with a 36th place finish, his worst result of the year. And Richard Petty, the king himself, was on his podcast the very next day, telling the world exactly what he saw. He didn't soften it. He didn't hedge. He said Wallace drove in there and knocked the door out of somebody. When a 7-time champion with over 1,000 career starts uses that kind of language, the entire sport pays attention. And the more you dig into what actually happened on lap 324 at Martinsville, the more you understand that this wasn't just a bad afternoon. This was a pressure cooker that had been building for weeks, and on Sunday it finally exploded in the worst possible way. To understand how Wallace ended up in that moment, you have to go back to the start of the 2026 season and look at what his teammate Tyler Reddick had been doing. What Reddick accomplished in the opening weeks of this season has genuinely never been seen before in the modern era of NASCAR. He won the first 3 Cup Series races of the year, becoming the first driver in history to ever accomplish that feat. He didn't stop there either. By the time the sport arrived at Martinsville, Reddick had won 4 of the first 6 races. 4 wins in 6 starts. The kind of dominance that rewrites what we think is possible in a sport this competitive and this unpredictable. And while Reddick was doing all of that, his 23XI racing teammate Bubba Wallace was racing clean, running consistently, sitting second in points at one stage, doing everything right. But doing everything right has a different feeling when the person parking next to you in the team lot is winning at a historic pace. Kyle Petty, Richard's son and one of the more thoughtful analysts in the sport, put it in terms that every competitor understands. He said you race your teammates. He said no matter what anybody tells you about team harmony and supporting your partner, every driver wants to be top of the heap within their own organization. And watching someone in your own camp achieve something no one in NASCAR history had ever done before creates a pressure that doesn't announce itself loudly. It builds quietly. It compounds. And Kyle Petty's argument, delivered on the Inside the Race podcast with a directness that stood out in a weekend full of commentary. Was that when Carson Hocevar made that 3-wide move on lap 323? He didn't just trigger frustration from a difficult race day. He lit a fuse that had been smoldering for weeks. Before getting into what Wallace did, it matters to be precise about what Hocevar actually did, because the 23-year-old driver of the number 77 Spire Motorsport Chevrolet carries a reputation that often colors the way people evaluate situations involving him. He has earned the nickname Hurricane Hocevar, and his aggressive style has made him an easy target whenever something goes wrong near him on the racetrack. But on that restart at Martinsville, Hocevar was not doing anything wrong. He drove 3 wide underneath Wallace heading into Turn 1. There was minor contact. He cleared Wallace coming out of Turn 2. That is Martinsville racing. That is exactly the kind of bold, committed, calculated aggression that the paperclip-shaped short track has always rewarded. Kyle Petty made this point explicitly and without any ambiguity. He said taking someone 3 wide at Martinsville is not cause for what happened next. What happened next was on Wallace entirely. As the field came out of Turn 2 and headed toward the back straightaway, Wallace pulled his car directly onto the rear bumper of the number 77. He hit Hocevar. Then he hit him again, and he kept pushing through turns 3 and 4. Not once, not twice, but multiple times across the exit of the corner. There was nothing accidental looking about the sequence. The replay shows a driver making a deliberate choice to respond, pressing the issue with his car against the back of Hocevar's Chevrolet across an extended stretch of the racetrack. On the exit of Turn 4, Hocevar's car snapped around. It came back across the front stretch sideways, and the cars behind had no time and nowhere to go. 12 cars were collected in what followed. Daniel Suarez, Chris Biesser, Austin Dillon, Austin Hill, Zane Smith, John Hunter Nemechek, Eric Jones, Michael McDowell, Connor Zilish, and Riley Herbst Wallace's own 23XI racing teammate, were all swept up in the crash. An enormous portion of the Cup Series field wiped out on lap 324 at a track where Wallace had previously won Truck Series races and openly described as one of his favorites. Wallace was taken to the infield care center immediately following the incident. When he emerged to speak with Fox Sports reporter Jamie Little on pit road, he did not try to sidestep the question. His explanation was that he misjudged. He acknowledged being frustrated by Hocevar's three-wide move, accepted that his frustration influenced his decision to respond, but maintained that he never intended to send the number 77 car spinning. His position was that he simply misjudged the corner, misjudged his speed, misjudged how much force he was applying to the back of that car. The problem is that the replay creates complications for that explanation. Multiple contacts across multiple corners at a short track where drivers understand exactly how much force their cars are capable of producing is a difficult sequence to attribute to a single miscalculation. Kevin Harvick, calling the race from the Fox Sports broadcast booth, said live on air that Wallace drove straight through the number 77 car. Harvick noted that Wallace had already been struggling before the contact with Hocevar and framed what happened not as a racing incident but as an emotional one, the visible release of something that had been building inside a driver having a difficult afternoon. The weight of the outside commentary was significant, but the voice that landed hardest came from inside the garage, from the man who had been standing in Martinsville Speedway watching the race unfold with his own eyes. Richard Petty addressed the incident on his podcast, The Petty Race Recap, the day after the race. His co-host, Dale Inman, attempted to describe what happened gently, suggesting Wallace had simply kind of gotten into Hocevar. Petty did not let that framing stand. He said, kinda got into him, he just drove on in there and knocked the door out of him. 7 Cup Series championships, over 1,000 career starts, a lifetime spent watching and understanding exactly what happens between racing cars on a short track. When Richard Petty tells the world that you knocked the door out of somebody, that assessment doesn't require any additional support. It is the most authoritative read of a racing incident that the sport is capable of producing. Steve Letarte, the NASCAR analyst, offered a reading of the incident that attempted to split the difference between intentional retaliation and pure accident. Letarte's argument was that Wallace clearly intended to make contact with Hocevar, intended to bump him and push him around to signal his displeasure, but that the wreck itself was the product of too much throttle and not enough precision. At Martinsville, he explained, the margin between bumping someone enough to move them and bumping someone hard enough to spin them is measured in fractions of a second on the accelerator. By that interpretation, Wallace understood where the line was. He just didn't execute the contact cleanly enough to stay on the right side of it. Whether that reading makes the outcome more forgivable or simply more frustrating is a matter of perspective, but it adds a layer of technical context that pure emotional explanations leave out. Nothing in the external commentary cut as cleanly as what came from Freddie Kraft, Wallace's own spotter. Kraft appeared on the Door Bumper Clear podcast and chose complete transparency over any attempt to manage the damage. He said there was not really any sugarcoating about it. He said he took Wallace at his word that it was a misjudgment, but then added that if it was a misjudgment, it was a really bad misjudgment, and it hurt. Then Kraft laid out the championship math in terms that made the true scale of the damage impossible to absorb slowly. He said they went from third in points to tied for 8th with 5 other guys. Given how NASCAR's tie-breaking procedures work in practice, that translated to Wallace falling from effectively 3rd to effectively 11th in a single afternoon. 8 positions in the standings, erased on lap 324. And then Kraft used the word that defines the whole situation more precisely than any other. He called it self-inflicted, not a tire going down, not a mechanical failure, not another driver taking Wallace out through no fault of his own. Self-inflicted, a decision or a misjudgment or some combination of both that ended Wallace's own race, damaged his own championship position, and collected his own teammate on the way out. The point about the current NASCAR point system is one that Fox Sports Motorsports insider Bob Pockrass raised in the aftermath. and it adds a financial and mathematical layer to the emotional one. Under the current chase format, there is no win and in mechanism available as a safety net during the regular season. Every point from every finish accumulates across the full 26 race schedule and determines playoff seeding. Pacra has calculated that Wallace finished the race at Martinsville with a single championship point. Hocevar, whose car his team had been forced to partially reconstruct during the race after Wallace's hits sent it sliding across the front stretch, finished 17th and collected 20 points. A 19-point swing between the two drivers in a single race is the kind of damage that requires multiple strong weekends and clean conditions to recover from. And in the compressed, consequence-heavy point structure of the modern era, that kind of swing is even more costly than the raw number suggests. There is something particularly sharp about the fact that all of this happened at Martinsville. This is Wallace's favorite track. He has said so openly throughout his career. He has won there in the Truck Series. He arrived at Martinsville this year sitting third in points with momentum behind him and the kind of early season results that make a driver feel like everything is finally coming together. And on a restart on lap 323, with the pressure of his teammates' historic season burning quietly in the background and a difficult afternoon already unfolding around him, the track that was supposed to be the one where he felt most comfortable bit him harder than any racetrack ever has. Wallace reflected on the weekend afterward with the exhausted candor of someone who cannot find an explanation that makes it feel any better. He said they could win Saturday in practice and just not show up on Sunday. He said he hated it for the team. He said he needed to take a week off, reset, and go to Bristol. Hocevar, for his part, handled the entire aftermath in a way that made the contrast with Wallace's situation even more pronounced. On the team radio immediately after his car came to rest sideways on the front stretch at Martinsville, Hocevar said simply, "Bubba shake and bake," the Talladega Nights reference delivered in real time inside an actual crash. In his media availability afterward, he was composed and forward-looking, expressing satisfaction with his crew's recovery work and turning his focus immediately to Bristol. His team had rebuilt his car mid-race. He had come back through the field to finish 17th, matching his personal best result at that track. And he walked away from the weekend with 20 championship points and the kind of clean narrative that tends to follow a driver who responded to adversity with composure rather than adding to it. The NASCAR Cup Series does not return to action until April 12th at Bristol Motor Speedway, giving everyone involved 1 week to process what happened at Martinsville. Wallace will arrive at Bristol sitting 11th in points, carrying back-to-back DNFs at Darlington and Martinsville that have dissolved the early promise of his 2026 season in the span of 2 weekends. Bristol is another short track, another venue where emotions run hot, and where the difference between a decisive move and a catastrophic one is measured in tenths of a second and fractions of an inch. The questions that follow him to Bristol are real ones. Whether the early season version of Bubba Wallace, the one sitting second in points and logging top 11 finishes in 4 of his first 5 starts, is still accessible. Whether the frustration that surfaced at Martinsville goes back underground or continues to find its way onto the racetrack. Whether a driver whose favorite track just produced the worst single race result of his 2026 season can compartmentalize cleanly enough to compete at the level his talent suggests he's capable of. Richard Petty saw what happened at Martinsville. Freddie Kraft called it self-inflicted. Kyle Petty drew the psychological map that explained how a historically dominant teammate, a difficult afternoon, and one aggressive restart move combined to produce 12 cars in the wall and an 8-position freefall in the standings. The damage is documented, the causes are understood. What nobody knows yet is whether Bubba Wallace is capable of leaving all of it at Martinsville, and what version of his season shows up when the Cup Series fires back to life at Bristol.